A U.S. platoon goes missing during training in 1952, and their base receives one final transmission that cuts off like a scream. They march into the sandhills on a routine 7-day exercise with maps, rations, and scheduled radio checks, the sort of obedience that should keep everyone alive. Days of searching turn surreal. Tracking dogs follow fresh boot prints to a creek and stop as if the earth itself refuses to give them up. A storm later tears open the ground and exposes a sealed concrete bunker, gear arranged with military precision, an officer's cap placed like a mocking trophy, frantic messages carved into the walls. What was buried in that bunker that could turn command into massacre, and who else knew the danger long before the bodies were found? The truck convoy rumbled to a halt where the paved road surrendered to sand and scrub pine. Dust settled slowly in the October morning heat, coating the canvas sides of 3 deuce-and-a-halfs in a film the color of old bone. First Lieutenant Jacob Mercer was the first to jump down, his boots hitting the Carolina sand with practiced authority. He stood motionless for a moment, shoulders tight beneath his field jacket, scanning the tree line with an intensity that belonged somewhere else, somewhere with different trees, colder winds, enemies who actually existed. The scar along his jaw, a pale crescent from the Chosin Reservoir, caught the slanting sunlight as he turned to watch his platoon disembark. 42 men, 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, most of them barely old enough to shave. "Form up!" Staff Sergeant Raymond Cole's voice carried the easy command of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. He moved among the recruits with the patience of a career NCO, adjusting a strap here, correcting posture there. His broad shoulders and sun-darkened face suggested competence the way a well-worn tool suggests reliability. The men assembled in loose formation, adjusting to the weight of their rucksacks. Private First Class Michael Torres fumbled with his radio pack, the heavy field transceiver making him list slightly to one side. At 20, he was compact and quick, with ink-stained fingers that never stopped fidgeting when he was nervous. He was nervous now. 7 days, gentlemen." Lieutenant Mercer's voice was clipped, precise. He held a map case but didn't open it. "Advanced wilderness survival and navigation through Training Area 7, 40,000 acres of the finest terrain the Army has to offer." A few of the younger soldiers exchanged glances. The sandhills had a reputation. Dense pine forests gave way without warning to treacherous swampland. Old logging roads led nowhere. The few locals who hunted these woods did so with caution and familiarity earned over generations. "We operate under field conditions," Mercer continued. His eyes swept the formation but seemed to focus on nothing, or perhaps on something no one else could see. Radio silence except for scheduled. Check-ins. You follow orders. You stay together. You remember your training. Private Daniel Ashworth stood near the back, his posture suggesting the prep school he'd attended before his father, Congressman Nathaniel Ashworth, had encouraged him to serve. At 19, he had the earnest face of someone who believed in rules and their purposes. He'd been watching Lieutenant Mercer for the past 2 weeks with growing concern, and that concern showed now in the tight set of his jaw. Staff Sergeant Cole stepped forward, his voice carrying a warmth Mercer's lacked. "Listen up. This isn't a camping trip. You watch where you step, you boil your water, and you stay with your fire team. The lieutenant and I have done this before. You do what we say, when we say it, and we all go home with a story to tell." The men relaxed fractionally. Cole had that effect, the steady presence of an older brother, a father, someone who'd keep you safe if you didn't do anything stupid. Lieutenant Mercer turned abruptly toward the tree line. "Move out. We're burning daylight." The platoon shouldered their gear and began the march into the sandhills. The terrain shifted gradually as they moved deeper into Training Area 7. The sandy soil gave way to dense undergrowth. Longleaf pines towered overhead, their trunks straight as pillars in some vast, shadowed cathedral. The October sun filtered through the canopy in pale shafts that illuminated nothing useful. Just patches of saw palmetto and the occasional flash of a copperhead sliding through dead leaves. Torres kept one hand on his radio pack, counting steps in his head the way they'd taught him in signal school. Every hour, he was supposed to check in with base. So far, Lieutenant Mercer hadn't given the order. "Sergeant Cole." Torres spoke quietly as the big NCO passed him. "Sir, it's been 90 minutes. Shouldn't we—" "The lieutenant will say when." Cole's voice was gentle but firm. He clapped Torres on the shoulder. "Save your batteries, son." By midday, they'd covered 8 miles. The recruits were sweating through their uniforms, the humidity clinging like a second skin despite the calendar saying autumn. Mercer called a halt near a dry creek bed, but he didn't sit. Instead, he paced the perimeter of their formation, eyes constantly moving, one hand resting on his holstered sidearm. "He's wound tight," whispered Private Eugene Morrison, a lean kid from South Carolina who'd joined for the airborne wings and discovered he was terrified of heights. Ashworth, crouched nearby, nodded slowly. "He's been like this since we started field training. My father says he should have been rotated stateside after Korea, given time to—" "Stow it." Cole appeared between them with his usual uncanny timing. "The lieutenant's business is the lieutenant's business. Your business is keeping your mouth shut and your feet moving." But Cole's eyes, when they tracked Mercer's pacing figure, held something that looked uncomfortably like worry. They pushed on through the afternoon. The map, when Torres caught a glimpse of it, showed their route skirting the western edge of a marked swamp, following established trails that would loop them through defensible camping sites marked from previous exercises. Except Lieutenant Mercer wasn't following the marked route. Torres wasn't the only one who noticed. By the time the sun began its descent, throwing long shadows through the pines, several of the men were exchanging glances. They were heading southeast into terrain the map labeled simply unmapped, restricted access. When Mercer finally called a halt, they were in a small clearing surrounded by dense saw palmetto. No water source, no defensive advantages, just a patch of open sand that felt exposed rather than safe. "Perimeter watch in 2-hour rotations," Mercer announced. "No fires." "Sir?" Cole approached carefully. "The men need hot food. It's cold rations only if we're in tactical." "No fires, Sergeant." Mercer's voice cracked like a whip. "We don't advertise our position." "Position from who, sir? This is a training. Are you questioning my orders, Staff Sergeant?" The clearing went silent. 42 men held their breath. Cole's face remained impassive, but his jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "No, sir. No fires. I'll set the watch rotation." The platoon settled into an uneasy bivouac. They ate cold sea rations and spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. Torres kept checking his radio, waiting for the order to make contact with base that never came. As full darkness fell, the sandhills came alive with sounds. Owls called to one another in the distance. Something large moved through the underbrush to the south. The wind picked up, making the pines creak and sway overhead. Lieutenant Mercer stood at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the purple sky. He hadn't eaten, hadn't sat down, just stood there, watching the tree line with the same hawkish intensity he'd shown that morning. Torres found Ashworth on watch duty, the young private's face pale in the moonlight. "This isn't right," Ashworth whispered. "We're off course. We missed 2 scheduled radio checks. Keep your voice down." Torres glanced toward where Mercer stood. "Maybe he's testing us, seeing how we handle unexpected—" "Does he look like he's testing us, Torres? Does he look like he's in control?" They both watched as Mercer took several steps toward the trees, then stopped. His lips were moving. He was talking to someone who wasn't there. "Listening posts," they heard him mutter. "Compromised perimeters. They're watching. They're always watching." Torres felt his skin prickle. "Who's watching, sir?" Mercer spun around so fast both privates flinched. His eyes were wide, reflecting moonlight like an animal's. For a long moment, he just stared at them, breathing hard. "Maintain your post, Private," he finally said, his voice distant, hollow. "The enemy never sleeps. We can't either." He turned back to the darkness and resumed his vigil. Torres and Ashworth exchanged a look that needed no words. They were 8 miles deep in some of the most isolated terrain in North Carolina, scheduled for 6 more days in the field, with a commanding officer who was talking to ghosts. In the center of the bivouac, Staff Sergeant Cole sat with his back against a pine, writing in a small notebook by the light of a shielded penlight. His wife Sarah would find those letters years later, carefully preserved, documenting everything he saw. October 14, 1952. First day in the Sandhills. Lieutenant Mercer is getting worse. He's seeing things that aren't there, hearing things. I'm trying to keep the men calm, but they're scared. I'm scared. Tomorrow, I'll try to convince him to call for extraction, claim equipment failure or something. We can't keep going like this. If something happens out here, Sarah, if I don't come back, know that I tried. I tried to protect them. The night deepened. The watches changed. And at the edge of the clearing, Lieutenant Jacob Mercer stood alone, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the pine forest, muttering about security breaches and enemy infiltration to an audience of shadows. The second morning breaks pale and uneasy over the sandhills. The platoon wakes to a chill that crept in during the night, their field jackets damp from condensation pooling in the low ground where Mercer insisted they make camp. The men shake out their bedrolls in silence, glancing toward the lieutenant who stands 50 yards from the bivouac staring at his map case as though it contains secrets only he can decipher. Private Torres kneels by his radio, checking connections for the third time. His hands move with the mechanical precision of worry. The scheduled 0800 check-in came and went 20 minutes ago. No call made, no permission given to skip it. Torres. Staff Sergeant Cole's voice carries the particular quiet of a man controlling his concern. Pack it up. We're moving out. Sarge, we missed. I know what we missed. Cole's eyes flick toward Mercer, then back. Pack it up. The men form up without the usual morning banter, sensing something shifted overnight. Private Daniel Ashworth shoulders his ruck and watches Lieutenant Mercer fold his map with the kind of care a man gives to something precious. When Mercer finally turns to address them, his face holds an expression Ashworth will later struggle to name, certainty edged with something that looks almost like grief. New route today. Mercer's voice cuts through the morning haze. Intelligence suggests our planned corridor is compromised. Cole steps forward, his tone measured. Sir, we're 6 miles from Checkpoint Bravo. If we deviate from the exercise plan... The exercise plan is a suggestion, Sergeant. My orders supersede it. Mercer taps the map case against his thigh, 3 sharp strikes like a gavel. We move northwest. There's an installation from the 40s out near the old Rockfish Creek facilities. Secure position. Good concealment. Lieutenant, that area isn't on our... That's why it's secure. Mercer's eyes lock onto Cole's, and for a moment something almost pleading flickers there. Trust me, Ray. I know what I'm doing. The use of Cole's first name, a breach of protocol, hangs in the air. Around them, 40 young men wait for their sergeant to decide whether to follow a commander who might be breaking or to challenge him and fracture whatever fragile order remains. Cole holds Mercer's gaze for 5 heartbeats. Then he nods once and turns to the platoon. You heard the lieutenant. Column formation. Morrison, you're on point with the compass. We're heading 320 degrees. The platoon moves out into terrain that grows stranger with each mile. The neat pine forests of the training area give way to older growth, twisted oaks draped in Spanish moss, cypress knees jutting from standing water that shouldn't exist this far from the creek. The ground turns soft, then treacherous. Twice men sink to their knees in hidden mud. By noon, Private Eugene Morrison halts the column and turns back to Cole, his face uncertain. Sarge, the compass is... It's drifting. I can't hold north. Cole moves forward, checks the instrument himself. The needle swings lazily, refusing to settle. He pulls his own compass from his jacket. Same erratic behavior. Mineral deposits, Mercer says from behind them, his voice carrying an odd satisfaction. Iron-rich soil. They used it to hide the facility. Natural countermeasure against enemy navigation. Sir, who used it? Ashworth can't stop himself from asking. This was ours, wasn't it? Mercer's smile doesn't reach his eyes. Ours. Theirs. Labels change depending on who's asking the questions, Private. The afternoon deteriorates into a forced march through increasingly hostile terrain. Saw Palmetto tears at uniforms. Water moccasins slide away from their boots. The men are thirsty. Canteens running low, but every water source looks stagnant, filmed with algae that shimmers with oil-slick colors. Torres catches up to Cole during a brief halt, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarge, we're 12 miles from the exercise boundary, maybe more. If we don't check in, I know. They'll send search parties. I know. Torres swallows hard. He's not. Sarge, he's not right. Cole turns to look at the radio operator, this 20-year-old kid from Newark who joined the Army to escape a tenement apartment and ended up following a haunted officer into a North Carolina swamp. He wants to tell Torres that everything will be fine, that Mercer is still the man who led them through drills with precision and purpose. But Cole has written too many letters to Sarah, documented too many incidents in careful, damning detail. Stay close to me, Cole says instead. When I give the word, we're going to... Sergeant! The shout comes from Morrison, up ahead. You need to see this! They push through a final wall of dense scrub oak and stop. In the clearing before them stands a structure that shouldn't exist. Concrete blast walls, half buried in kudzu and decades of forest growth. A heavy steel door set into the hillside, rusted but intact, with faded stenciling that reads, Authorized personnel only. Fort Bragg, Research Station. 7. Mercer walks past them all, moving toward the entrance with the focused purpose of a man returning home. Here, he says simply, this is where we'll be safe. The platoon gathers in a loose semicircle, 42 men staring at a building that appears on no map they've ever seen. Ashworth moves close to Torres. We need to get word out, he whispers. Tonight, when he's asleep. He doesn't sleep, Torres whispers back. Haven't you noticed? Mercer runs his hand along the doorframe almost reverently. From his jacket he produces a pry bar. When did he pack that? And begins working at the rusted hinges. Cole watches his lieutenant labor at the door and feels a cold certainty settle in his chest. This was never about training. Mercer has been planning this. Sir, Cole's voice carries command now, not deference. We need to discuss this with the platoon. This facility isn't part of our... It's exactly part of our mission, Sergeant. Mercer doesn't turn from his work. This is what they don't tell you in the briefings, the real threats. The ones that get inside your head and make you think you're safe when you're compromised. With a shriek of protesting metal, the door swings inward. The smell that emerges is old air, chemical residue, and something else, something that makes several men step backward instinctively. Mercer pulls a flashlight from his belt and shines it into the darkness. The beam illuminates a concrete corridor descending into the earth, walls lined with pipes and conduits that disappear into shadow. Inside, Mercer orders. All of you. We'll secure the perimeter from within. No one moves. That's an order. Cole steps forward, places himself between Mercer and the platoon. When he speaks, his voice holds the weight of 15 years in uniform and a terrible, dawning understanding. Lieutenant Mercer, I'm respectfully requesting we bivouac topside tonight and reassess in the morning with clear heads and... The sound of Mercer drawing his sidearm cuts through every other noise. 42 men freeze. The lieutenant holds the pistol pointed at the ground, but his thumb rests on the hammer. You're compromised, Ray. Mercer's voice breaks on the words. I've been watching. All of you. Little signs, the way you question orders, the way you want to call back to base. They got to you already, didn't they? The infiltration. That's why you want to stay exposed out here. Jacob. Cole uses his first name deliberately, trying to reach the man beneath the paranoia. There. Weapon down. We're your men. We're not compromised. We're just tired and lost, and we need to get inside. The roar echoes across the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, birds scatter from trees. The platoon looks to Cole. He sees it in their faces. The question of whether to rush their lieutenant, to overpower him, to run. He sees Morrison's hand drifting toward his own sidearm. He sees Ashworth's jaw set with the particular stubbornness of the righteously angry. And he sees that if they resist now, in this clearing, Mercer will start shooting. The man is balanced on a razor's edge, and 42 lives depend on Cole making the right choice. Cole raises his hand slowly, palms out. "All right, sir, we'll go inside." Everyone stays calm. He turns to the platoon, his eyes communicating what his voice cannot. "You heard the lieutenant. Form up. We're securing this position." One by one, the men of 2nd Platoon file into the darkness. Torres goes 3rd, glancing back at the daylight as though memorizing it. Ashworth goes 10th, his hands clenched into fists. Morrison goes 20th, his compass still spinning uselessly in his pocket. Cole goes last, pausing at the threshold. "This is a mistake, Jacob," he says quietly. Mercer meets his eyes, and for just a moment the other man is there, the decorated officer, the leader, the friend. "I'm saving you, Ray. All of you. You just don't know it yet." Then Mercer steps inside and throws a lever. With a grinding mechanical sound that suggests long-dormant systems coming to life, the steel door begins to swing closed. Cole has 5 seconds to decide, to run, to fight, to call for help. He goes inside. The door seals behind them with a hollow boom that sounds like a tomb closing. 3 days later, in the pre-dawn darkness of October 17th, Corporal James Donnelly sits at his radio post, half asleep. The night shift at Fort Bragg is usually quiet, punctuated only by scheduled check-ins from training units scattered across the reservation. The burst of static that explodes from his receiver makes him knock over his coffee. The morning of October 23rd arrived with a sky the color of dull pewter. At Fort Bragg headquarters, Corporal James Donnelly stood outside the commanding officer's door, his hand trembling slightly as he held the incident report he'd filed 3 days ago. The paper was soft from handling, the corners worn from being read and reread in the radio hut during his sleepless overnight shifts. He'd highlighted the timestamp, 0243 hours, and underlined Private Torres's truncated plea for extraction. The door opened. Colonel Henshaw, a man whose face seemed permanently creased from squinting at maps, glanced down at Donnelly with the faint irritation of someone interrupted during breakfast. "The transmission, sir," Donnelly said before he could lose his nerve. "From 2nd Platoon. It's been 3 days, and—" "I read your report, Corporal." Henshaw's tone was flat. "Lieutenant Mercer restored order. Staff Sergeant Cole confirmed the situation was under control. Sir, with respect, that's what concerns me. Torres sounded spooked. It's a survival exercise, son. Men get rattled in the field." Henshaw moved to step past him, but Donnelly shifted slightly, blocking the narrow hallway. "SSG Cole cut him off mid-transmission, sir. The whole exchange lasted maybe 20 seconds. Donnelly swallowed. "That's not protocol for a training check-in. That's someone shutting down a distress call." Henshaw studied him for a long moment. Outside, through the window at the end of the corridor, the pale October sun was beginning to burn through the overcast. Somewhere in the distance, a drill instructor's cadence echoed across the parade grounds. "You flagging this because you think Lieutenant Mercer can't handle his command?" Henshaw asked quietly. "I'm flagging it because something felt wrong. Lieutenant Mercer is a decorated combat officer. Staff Sergeant Cole has 15 years in. They're overseeing 40 green recruits in challenging terrain. If Cole says the situation is managed, then it's managed." Henshaw's voice softened just slightly. "The platoon's due back tomorrow. If they're not here by noon on the 21st, we'll revisit. Until then, stand down." Donnelly's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. The colonel walked past, boot heels sharp on the linoleum. At the end of the hall, he paused without turning. "You did right to file the report, Corporal, but don't mistake field stress for catastrophe. Not yet." Then he was gone. Donnelly stood alone in the corridor, gripping the report. Through the window, he could see the flagpole in the center of the quad, the stars and stripes snapping in a wind that smelled like coming rain. October 21st came and went with no platoon. The radio hut stayed silent. Donnelly monitored all frequencies, sent repeated calls on the designated channel, heard nothing but static hiss and the occasional bleed-through from civilian broadcasts. At 1400 hours, he walked the report up the chain again, this time adding a handwritten note at the bottom. 48 HRs overdue. Request search authorization. He delivered it to Henshaw's office and was told the colonel was in conference. By nightfall, the entire base knew. Word traveled the way it always did in the Army, through mess halls and barracks, whispered between sentries during shift change. 42 men missing. A decorated lieutenant gone dark. Families would be calling soon, wanting answers no one had. In Washington, Congressman Nathaniel Ashworth received a courtesy notification from the Department of the Army. His son Daniel had failed to return from a routine training exercise. The situation was being monitored. There was no cause for alarm. Ashworth made 3 phone calls. The first was to his wife, to tell her gently and without detail. The second was to the Secretary of the Army, to demand an immediate briefing. The third was to his Chief of Staff, instructing him to prepare a public statement, not yet, but soon, if answers didn't materialize. The congressman sat alone in his office afterward, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. Daniel, in his dress uniform, solemn and proud, taken the day he'd completed basic training. 19 years old. An only child who'd insisted on serving despite a dozen ways his father could have kept him home. Ashworth closed his eyes and prayed to a God he didn't entirely believe in that his son was simply lost, cold, and scared, and not something worse. October 22nd brought fog. At Fort Bragg, the base commander convened an emergency briefing in the operations center. Topographic maps of Training Area 7 covered the tables, marked with grease pencil to indicate 2nd Platoon's intended route. The 7-day exercise plan was clipped to a corkboard. Insertion point, waypoints, extraction coordinates. Everything methodical. Everything routine. Except they weren't where they were supposed to be. "Last confirmed position?" the base commander asked. A junior officer pointed to a red circle on the map, northwest of the insertion point. "Day 2 campsite, sir. Search teams located cold fire pits and ration tins yesterday evening. No weapons, no rucksacks, no personnel." "How far off their planned route?" "Approximately 4 miles, sir. Due northwest instead of the designated northeast heading." The room went quiet. 4 miles was significant. It suggested either navigational error or deliberate deviation, and an officer like Mercer didn't make 4-mile mistakes by accident. Henshaw spoke from the back of the room, his voice carefully neutral. Lieutenant Mercer was experienced in orienteering. If he went northwest, he had a reason. "Or a malfunction," someone suggested. "Compass failure." 42 men don't all have broken compasses, another officer countered. The base commander raised a hand for silence. He was a pragmatic man, a veteran of 2 wars, and he understood that speculation without evidence was worthless. "We're initiating a full search operation effective immediately. I want 300 men in the field by dawn. K-9 units, aerial reconnaissance, the works. Divide the area into grids and sweep every acre." He looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. 2nd Platoon went into those woods 5 days ago, with a week's supplies and full gear. They're either injured, lost, or deliberately avoiding contact. Whichever it is, we're going to find them. October 23rd, 0600 hours. The search began as the sun crept over the pines, burning off the last of the fog. 300 soldiers moved into Training Area 7 in coordinated lines, calling out grid references as they advanced through the scrub and sand. Overhead, spotter planes crisscrossed the sky, pilots scanning the endless green canopy for anything anomalous. Smoke, signal panels, disturbed, Earth. The K-9 teams worked the Day 2 campsite first. German shepherds and bloodhounds circled the cold fire pits, sniffing at discarded tins and boot prints pressed into the dirt. The lead handler, a grizzled sergeant named Polk, watched his dog, a hound named Rebel who'd tracked deserters across 3 states, suddenly freeze near the northern tree line. Rebel's nose worked the air, then dropped to the ground. He pulled hard on the lead, nearly yanking Polk off his feet, and plunged into the underbrush with the single-minded intensity of a scent locked. Polk followed, calling coordinates into his radio as Rebel led him northwest, deeper into the unmapped sections of the training area. The trail was strong, purposeful. 40-plus men moving together left a signature even days later. Crushed vegetation, disturbed soil, the faint petroleum smell of boot leather and gun oil. The trail led to Rockfish Creek. Rebel stopped at the water's edge, whining. He paced the muddy bank, circling back on himself, nose to the ground and then to the air, confused, agitated. Polk crouched beside him, scanning the far side of the creek. The water was shallow, easily fordable. Boot prints led to the edge. Then nothing. No prints on the opposite bank, no signs of a crossing upstream or down. It was as if 42 men had walked into the creek and vanished. "Lost the scent," Polk reported into his radio, frustration evident, requesting additional units to expand search radius from Rockfish Creek. But the other K-9 teams reported the same. Trails that led to water and stopped. Scents that faded into nothing. Dogs that whined and refused to cross. By midday, the search had expanded to a 10-mile radius. Soldiers waded through swampland, hacked through briar thickets, checked abandoned hunting blinds and forgotten CCC work sites from the Depression. They found old tools, empty cabins, deer carcasses, but no trace of 2nd Platoon. At 15:30 hours, a team working the western edge of the search area stumbled upon the ruins of an old civilian Conservation Corps camp. Its wooden structures collapsed into rotted skeletons overgrown with kudzu. The site wasn't on any current maps, a relic from 2 decades past. The team leader, a lieutenant named Graves, ordered his men to spread out and search the ruins. Most of the buildings had succumbed to weather and time, their floors thick with leaf litter and animal nests. But near the center of the camp, partially hidden by fallen timbers, was the entrance to a root cellar. The door had collapsed inward years ago. Graves approached carefully, flashlight in hand, and peered into the darkness below, fresh boot prints in the dust. "Jesus Christ," one of his men whispered. "They were here." Graves descended cautiously, bracing himself against the earthen walls. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet by 10, with a low ceiling supported by rotting beams. Tools hung on the walls, shovels, pickaxes, an anvil on a crude workbench. Everything coated in rust and cobwebs, except for one thing. On the anvil, placed with deliberate care, was an officer's cap. The insignia identified it immediately. First Lieutenant, U.S. The K-9 units arrived at dawn. Sergeant William Polk watched his dog, a German shepherd named Titan, leap from the transport truck with an eagerness that felt almost obscene under the circumstances. 42 men were missing somewhere in this endless expanse of sand and pine, and here was Titan, tail wagging, ready to work. "Take the northeast quadrant," the search coordinator ordered, jabbing a finger at the map spread across the hood of his Jeep. "Grid pattern, slow and thorough." Polk nodded, though the instruction felt unnecessary. He'd been doing this for 8 years, finding deserters, tracking escaped prisoners, recovering the occasional hunter who'd wandered too far from the trail. This was different, though. This was an entire platoon. By mid-morning, Titan had picked up the first scent trail near the abandoned Day 3 campsite. The dog moved with purpose through the scrub pine, nose low, pulling Polk deeper into terrain that grew increasingly foreign. The pines thinned. The sandy soil gave way to dark mud that sucked at their boots with each step. The trail led them to Rockfish Creek. Titan stopped at the water's edge, circling once, twice, 3 times. His ears flattened against his skull. A low whine built in his throat. Not the eager sound of a dog on a scent, but something else, something wrong. "What is it, boy?" Polk crouched beside him, running a hand along the dog's trembling flank. "Where'd they go?" Titan sat, refusing to move forward. His nose pointed at the creek, but his body language screamed refusal. Polk scanned the opposite bank. No disturbed vegetation, no boot prints in the mud. The water itself ran shallow here, ankle-deep at most, and clear enough to see the rocky bottom. No way 42 men had crossed without leaving some trace. He keyed his radio. "Polk to command. I've got a trail termination at Rockfish Creek. Grid reference November 7-3. The scent just ends." Static crackled. "Say again, Polk?" "The trail ends at the water. No crossing indicators. It's like they walked into the creek and vanished." A long pause. "Hold position. We're sending another team to verify." By noon, 3 more K9 units had converged on the creek bank. 3 more dogs displayed the same bizarre behavior, circling, whining, refusing to cross the water despite clear commands. Their handlers stood in a loose circle, exchanging looks that ranged from confused to unnerved. "This don't make sense," muttered Corporal Hayes, a handler from the 101st. His bloodhound, Sadie, had tracked escaped convicts through worse terrain than this. Now she sat shivering, her eyes fixed on something none of them could see. "Maybe they split up," another handler suggested, "scattered to confuse pursuit." 42 men? Polk shook his head. "In perfect formation for 3 days, then they suddenly scatter, and not one dog picks up a divergent trail?" Lieutenant Morrison arrived an hour later, his crisp uniform already wilting in the October humidity. He studied the creek with visible frustration, then turned to address the assembled handlers. "Expand the search radius. 500 yards upstream and downstream. If they crossed somewhere else, we'll find it." They didn't. By late afternoon, teams had walked 2 miles of creek bank in both directions. The scent trails converged at this one spot, this unremarkable bend in an unremarkable stream, and simply ceased to exist. "Sir." One of the privates assigned to the search approached Morrison cautiously. "There's something else you should see." The abandoned CCC camp sat 300 yards northeast of the creek, barely visible through the overgrowth. The Civilian Conservation Corps had built it during the Depression, a base camp for young men planting pines and building roads. The government had shuttered it in 1942 when the war pulled those men away to different service. What remained looked like a movie set for the apocalypse. Collapsed barracks with moss-covered roofs. A stone chimney standing alone where its building had rotted away. Rusted tools scattered in the weeds like archaeological artifacts. Polk followed the private toward what appeared to be the camp's center. A dozen soldiers already stood in a loose perimeter, staring at the ground. They'd found the root cellar by accident. One of the searchers had stepped on a rotted board and fallen through, twisting his ankle in the process. The boards had concealed a square opening, roughly 6 feet on each side, descending into darkness. "Watch your step, Sergeant," Morrison warned as Polk approached the edge. The opening gaped like a mouth. Crude stone walls descended 8 feet to a dirt floor littered with debris, broken crates, ancient preserving jars, the skeletal remains of wooden shelves, and boot prints. Fresh boot prints. Polk felt his stomach tighten. The cellar floor showed clear impressions, dozens of them, overlapping, leading from the narrow ladder to nowhere. The dirt along the walls was undisturbed. No tunnel entrance, no escape route, just boot prints converging at the ladder's base. "Get some light down there," Morrison ordered. 2 soldiers rigged a portable floodlight, lowering it on a rope. The harsh white beam transformed the cellar into a stage, throwing sharp shadows against the stone walls. The boot prints became even more distinct, easily 40 or 50 individual impressions, maybe more. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. In the center of the floor, placed with deliberate care on a rusted anvil, sat Lieutenant Jacob Mercer's officer's cap. Polk had seen it 100 times before the platoon deployed. Mercer wore it with the same rigid precision he applied to everything else. The worn leather brim, the tarnished brass insignia. Even from 8 feet up, Polk recognized it. How the hell did that get down there? Hayes breathed. Morrison's face had gone pale. I want this entire site cordoned off. Nobody in or out except forensics. And somebody get me a camera crew. Document everything. Polk couldn't look away from the cap. Its placement felt wrong. Not dropped or discarded, but positioned. Displayed. Like someone had wanted them to find it. Sergeant Polk! Morrison's voice cut through his thoughts. Take Titan around the perimeter. See if he picks up anything leading away from this location. Polk gave the standard affirmative, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd seen Titan's reaction at the creek. The dog knew something they didn't. They circled the entire camp twice. Titan found nothing. Or rather, he found boot prints leading in. The same trail from the creek, clear as day. But nothing leading out. 42 men had walked to this forgotten place and apparently ceased to exist. By evening, Fort Bragg's motor pool had become a staging ground for increasingly desperate theories. Polk sat on the tailgate of a transport truck, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from a supply sergeant, listening to officers argue. Underground tunnel system, a captain insisted. Has to be. They went down into that cellar and found an old escape route. We excavated the entire floor, Morrison countered. Solid dirt, solid stone walls. There's no tunnel. Then they backfilled it, covered their tracks. In what? With what tools? And why leave the cap behind? No one had an answer for that. Polk ground out his cigarette and watched the sun sink behind the tree line. Somewhere in the sandhills, 42 men had walked into the earth and disappeared. The dogs couldn't track them. The searchers couldn't find them. And every clue led only to more impossible questions. Titan whined from the truck bed behind him. Polk reached back to scratch the dog's ears, feeling the persistent tremor in the animal's frame. I know, boy, he murmured. I know. Across the camp, Corporal James Donnelly emerged from the communications tent, transcript pages clutched in his hand. He'd listened to that final transmission 17 times now, wearing grooves in the tape. Each replay revealed new details, background sounds he'd missed in the moment, fabric rustling, multiple voices speaking over each other, and underneath it all, a low hum that might have been machinery or might have been something else entirely. He found Lieutenant Morrison near the map table, staring at the grid coordinates with hollow eyes. Sir, Donnelly said quietly, permission to submit a revised analysis of the radio transmission? Morrison looked up, his expression somewhere between hope and dread. You found something? Not found, sir. There's audio anomalies I can't explain, echo patterns that don't match field equipment, and the cutoff wasn't clean. Someone didn't just switch the radio off. They interrupted mid-transmission, mid-word, almost. He paused. It felt like they were stopped, sir, not like they chose to stop. Morrison took the transcript, scanning it for the 100th time. The words hadn't changed, but their weight increased with each reading. What do you think happened to them, Corporal? Donnelly watched the last light fade from the sky, turning the pines into black silhouettes against deep purple. I think they found something out there, sir, or something found them, and I think Staff Sergeant Cole's final transmission wasn't meant to reassure us. He met Morrison's eyes. I think it was a warning. The briefing room at Fort Bragg smelled of burnt coffee and stale cigarette smoke. February light filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, striping the oak conference table where 20 men in various uniforms sat in exhausted silence. Special Agent Theodore Vance of the FBI's Charlotte Field Office tapped his pen against a manila folder, thick with reports that led nowhere. Across from him, Colonel Paul Henshaw's jaw worked as if grinding down words he couldn't say aloud. 4 months, Vance said, breaking the silence. We've turned over 40,000 acres, dragged every pond, excavated that CCC site down to bedrock, interviewed 200 civilians. Congressman Ashworth has called my office 17 times this week alone. So someone tell me, 42 soldiers do not simply vanish into thin air. Major Curtis Reeves, head of the expanded search operation, spread topographic maps across the table with deliberate care. Red circles marked search zones. Blue pins indicated findings. A cold campsite, discarded sea ration tins, the CCC camp. The pins clustered in a small section of the vast expanse of yellow and green. "Sir, with respect, we've exhausted conventional search methodology." Reeves's finger traced the creek. "The K-9 units won't cross rockfish. We brought in teams from 3 different states. Same result. The dogs hit the water and refused to proceed." "Dogs aren't oracles, Major." "No, sir. But in 30 years of search and rescue, I've never seen that behavior without cause." Henshaw cleared his throat. "Agent Vance, the desertion theory, is politically convenient nonsense." Vance's interruption was sharp. "These boys had no motive. Half were barely 18. They weren't slated for Korea deployment for another 6 months. No history of radicalism, no financial troubles, no pattern suggesting coordinated flight." A younger officer, Lieutenant Morrison, leaned forward. "The evidence at the CCC camp suggests deliberate staging. The cap placement, the boot prints. Someone wanted us to find that location." "To what end?" "I don't know, sir. Misdirection, maybe." Vance opened his folder, removing a photograph. Lieutenant Jacob Mercer's service portrait stared up from the glossy paper. Alert eyes, firm jaw, chest decorated with Korean service ribbons. "Let's discuss the elephant in the room. Lieutenant Mercer's psychiatric evaluation from March 1951. He read from a photocopied report. Subject exhibits paranoid ideation consistent with combat trauma. Recommends immediate discharge and civilian psychiatric care. Stamped and overruled by Personnel Command 3 days later due to officer shortages." The room shifted uncomfortably. "That evaluation was flagged," Henshaw said quietly. "We had protocols. You had a decorated officer showing signs of mental collapse, and you sent him into the woods with 41 young men." Vance's voice remained level, but his knuckles whitened around the pen. "Staff Sergeant Cole documented Mercer's behavior in letters to his wife. We've recovered 4 of them from Mrs. Cole. Would you like me to read excerpts?" Henshaw's face grayed. "That won't be necessary." "Jacob hasn't slept in 3 days." Vance read anyway. "He checks the perimeter every hour, claims he hears enemy radio traffic. Yesterday he accused Private Morrison of being a Chinese infiltrator. I'm holding the platoon together with spit and prayer." He looked up. "That's from October 9th, 5 days before you sent them out." "We didn't know." "You didn't ask." Vance closed the folder. "And now we have 42 missing men, a compromised officer, and 1 panicked radio transmission that your corporal—" He glanced at notes. "Corporal Donnelly insists was terminated under duress." Across the table, Corporal James Donnelly sat rigid, dark circles under his eyes. He'd requested to attend the briefing against protocol. "Permission to speak, sir?" His voice cracked slightly. Henshaw nodded. "I've listened to that transmission 200 times. SSG Cole did not sound like a man regaining control of a situation. He sounded like someone being watched. The cutoff wasn't natural radio procedure. Someone grabbed the handset mid-transmission, and there were sounds underneath the voices. Mechanical sounds. Echo patterns that suggest—" "Suggest what, Corporal?" Vance leaned forward. Donnelly swallowed. "An enclosed space. Concrete walls, maybe. Not forest terrain." Major Reeves frowned. "There are no structures in that grid sector." "No known structures," Donnelly corrected softly. The distinction hung in the air. Vance made a note. "I want engineering corps to review survey maps from the 1940s. Every bunker, every installation, every foundation within a 10-mile radius of the training area." "Agent Vance," Henshaw said carefully, "much of that material is classified. Then declassify it, or I'll have Senator Ashworth do it for you." The threat needed no elaboration. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat. "Sir, there's another possibility we haven't fully explored. What if they're alive and being held?" "By whom?" The Soviets? In North Carolina? Vance's skepticism was evident. By each other. Morrison's words fell like stones into water. What if Lieutenant Mercer's paranoia escalated? What if he's keeping them somewhere, convinced they're compromised or infected, or... For 4 months, with no resupply? Reeves shook his head. They'd have run out of rations by November. Unless they found shelter. Supplies. Vance studied the younger officer. You're suggesting Mercer took them hostage. I'm suggesting we don't know his mental state. If he believed his men were enemy agents, if his delusions were severe enough. Morrison gestured helplessly. Maybe he convinced them they needed to hide. Maybe he threatened them. We found his cap, but not his body. The possibility settled over the room like groundwater seeping through limestone. Mrs. Cole received a telegram 2 weeks ago, Vance said quietly, retrieving another document. Unsigned, postmarked from Raleigh. It said, Raymond is where he needs to be. The mission continues. Do not search. Fort Bragg's postal inspection found no prints, no traceable origin. Henshaw's head snapped up. Why wasn't I informed? Because it might be a cruel hoax, or it might be evidence that someone in that platoon is alive and sending messages. Vance tapped the paper. Mrs. Cole showed it to a handwriting analyst. The block letters matched samples from her husband's field notes. Distinctive formation of capital R's, specific spacing patterns. The implications spread like cracks in ice. If SSG Cole is alive and in contact, Morrison said slowly, why wouldn't he reveal their location? Why the cryptic message? No one had an answer. Outside, February wind rattled the windows. Somewhere on the base, a drill sergeant's cadence echoed across the parade ground. Normal sounds of military life, achingly ordinary against the impossible questions filling the room. Vance stood, gathering his materials. Gentlemen, I'm recommending the investigation remain active but transition to a recovery operation rather than rescue. The probability of survival after 4 months in winter conditions approaches 0. What we're looking for now are remains and answers. Congressman Ashworth had said the same thing 2 days earlier, his voice hollow over the telephone. Just bring my son home. I don't care what's left of him. We'll continue grid searches through March, Henshaw said, the words sounding like surrender. After that, we'll reassess based on weather and available resources. Everyone in the room understood. After March, the search would be suspended. The paperwork would begin. Missing. Presumed dead. Donnelly spoke again, softer now. What about the sounds on the transmission? The ones underneath? Vance paused at the door. What about them? I made a copy. Unauthorized. Donnelly's admission came with visible effort. I slowed it down. Isolated frequencies. There's a voice beneath SSG Cole's sign-off. Very faint. Saying what? Donnelly met the agent's eyes. It says, help us. But it's not any of the platoon's voices. It's older, rougher, like someone else was down there with them. The room went cold. Give me the tape, Vance said. I destroyed it. Donnelly's voice was barely audible. I was ordered to, but I heard it first. I know what I heard. No one challenged him. No one wanted to. As Vance left the briefing room, he passed a bulletin board in the hallway covered with photographs. 42 young faces smiling in dress uniform, their futures reduced to question marks and desperate theories. Private Ashworth's aristocratic features, PFC Torres with his nervous grin, SSG Cole's steady paternal gaze, and Lieutenant Jacob Mercer, whose decorations couldn't erase the 1,000-yard stare already visible in his eyes. In his car, Vance sat for long minutes before starting the engine. Through the windshield, Fort Bragg's training areas stretched toward distant tree lines where the sandhills began. Thousands of acres of pine and sand and secrets the land refused to yield. Somewhere out there, he thought. Somewhere in all that silence. But the silence, as Donnelly could have told him, was never truly empty. It was full of things that couldn't be said aloud, things that turned away dogs and defied explanation, things that waited. Sarah Cole kept her husband's photograph on the mantelpiece in the front room of the small house on Maple Street in Valdosta, Georgia. The frame was brass, tarnished at the edges, and the photo showed Raymond in his dress uniform, cap squared precisely, the hint of a smile softening his formal expression. The picture had been taken in the spring of 1951, before Korea, before Fort Bragg, before the letter she'd received in February 1953, informing her that Staff Sergeant Raymond H. Cole was missing, presumed dead. August 1969 marked 17 years since that October when her husband had marched into the Carolina Pines and never marched out. Sarah was 52 now, gray threading through her dark hair, reading glasses perched on the hall table beside the telephone. The grief had softened over the years into something quieter, a permanent weight she'd learned to carry. Their son, Thomas, was grown, married, teaching history at the high school. Life had continued in the way it does, filling the space around loss without ever quite filling the loss itself. She dusted the photograph every Sunday after church, careful not to smudge the glass. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and she'd offer the official story. Training accident, never recovered, honored for his service. She didn't mention the stranger aspects, the vanished trail at Rockfish Creek, the officer's cap on the anvil, the silence that had swallowed 42 men whole. The other families had scattered across the country, bound together by unanswered questions and the shared weight of not knowing. Every year, on October 17th, Sarah received 3 or 4 cards. One from Rita Torres in Newark, whose son Michael had made that panicked radio call. One from Margaret Morrison in Tennessee, whose boy Eugene had been just 19. Sometimes one from Senator Ashworth's office, though the senator himself never signed it anymore. They'd all moved on. They'd had to, but the question remained, persistent as a splinter worked too deep to extract. What happened to them? 300 miles northeast, in the Piedmont country outside Raleigh, Luther Simmons sat on his porch watching the sky darken. The radio in the kitchen was crackling with urgent voices talking about Hurricane Camille, a monster storm that had torn through Mississippi and was now slouching up the coast, weakening but still dangerous. The National Weather Service was predicting heavy rain, flash flooding, possible tornadoes. Luther was 67, his face weathered like old oak, hands thick and calloused from a lifetime working land his family had sharecropped since before he was born. His small farm sat on the ragged edge of what had once been Fort Bragg's training grounds, a narrow strip of property his grandfather had claimed during Reconstruction. The Army had tried to buy him out twice in the 50s, offering fair money, but Luther's family had roots here that went deeper than money could measure. His blue-tick hound, Ezra, lay at his feet, chin on paws, watching the wind pick up in the pines. The sky had taken on a peculiar yellow-green cast, and the air felt heavy, electric. Luther had lived through plenty of hurricanes, Hazel in 54, Donna in 60, but something about this one felt different. The land itself seemed restless. Behind the house, Rockfish Creek was already swelling, brown water churning past its usual banks. Luther had moved his tools and his good furniture to the loft earlier in the day, just to be safe. Now there was nothing to do but wait and watch. The wind began to howl around 7 in the evening, a low moan that built into a shriek. Rain came horizontal, battering the tin roof like gravel. Luther sat in his kitchen with a kerosene lamp and his Bible, listening to the storm tear at the world outside. Ezra whined under the table, uneasy in a way Luther had never seen. "Easy, now," Luther murmured, but the dog wouldn't settle. The power had gone out at sunset. Through the window, Luther could see nothing but darkness and the occasional lightning flash illuminating sheets of rain. The creek was a roar he could hear even over the wind, a sound like continuous thunder rolling through the ground itself. Around midnight, something changed. The wind shifted direction, and Luther felt more than heard a deep groan from somewhere beneath the house. Not the timbers settling, something else, something old and deep giving way. He gripped the table edge and waited for the storm to pass. By dawn, the wind had died to occasional gusts, and the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. Luther stepped onto his porch, boots squelching in the saturated earth. The yard was a lake, water halfway up the porch steps. Branches and debris littered the ground. One of his outbuildings had lost its roof entirely. But the house still stood, and Luther still breathed, and that meant the work of recovery could begin. He splashed down into the yard, Ezra following reluctantly. The dog kept close to his heels, nose working overtime, spooked by scents the storm had churned up. They walked the property line, Luther assessing damage, already mentally tallying what could be salvaged and what was lost. The creek had receded some, but was still running high and brown, carrying whole trees downstream. The banks had been reshaped, carved into new configurations by the force of the water. Luther stood looking at land he'd known his entire life rendered suddenly unfamiliar. That's when Ezra bolted. The hound took off toward the back fence line, barking in a way Luther had never heard. High, frantic, almost terrified. Luther called after him, but the dog didn't respond. He just kept running toward the old property corner where the fence met a stand of water oak and pine. Luther followed, cursing under his breath, his boots heavy with mud. As he got closer, he saw what had drawn the dog's attention. The earth had opened. Where there had been flat ground the day before, there was now a depression. No, a sinkhole, maybe 15 feet across. The floodwaters had torn away the soil and exposed something underneath, something that wasn't dirt or rock. Concrete. Luther approached slowly, his heart beginning to pound. Ezra stood at the edge of the hole, barking down into it, hackles raised. The dog wouldn't go near the opening, but wouldn't leave it either. "Ezra, come here," Luther commanded, but the hound ignored him. Luther peered over the edge. The sinkhole descended maybe 12 feet, and at the bottom, partially exposed by erosion, was a concrete structure. Reinforced. Man-made. The top of what looked like a bunker or cellar, with iron rungs set into the wall leading down to a heavy door. The door was partially visible, caked in mud but unmistakable. Solid metal with a wheel lock, the kind you'd see on a ship or a bank vault. Luther stared at it, a cold feeling creeping through his chest despite the humid morning air. He'd lived on this land his whole life, his father before him, his grandfather before that. There had never been any building here, no structure of any kind. Just scrub pine and sandy soil and the slow, quiet accumulation of years. But the storm had torn the earth open, and underneath, something had been waiting. Ezra's barking had changed pitch, lower now, a continuous anxious whine. The dog backed away from the hole, tail tucked, and looked at Luther with frightened eyes that seemed to beg, "Let's leave. Let's go back to the house." Luther wanted to. Every instinct told him to turn around, to pretend he'd never seen this, to let the earth keep its secrets. But he was a practical man, and practical men didn't ignore strange bunkers appearing on their property. If there was military ordnance down there, or chemicals, or anything dangerous, he needed to know. He needed to tell someone. He pulled Ezra away from the edge, speaking low and calm, though his own hands were shaking. The hound finally allowed himself to be led back toward the house, but he kept looking over his shoulder, whining. Luther got the dog inside and dried him off, then stood in his kitchen looking at the telephone on the wall. The lines were probably down from the storm, but he tried anyway, lifting the receiver to his ear. Static, then a faint dial tone. The miracle of it almost made him laugh. He dialed the county sheriff's office and waited while it rang. Outside the window, he could see the dark mouth of the sinkhole, the concrete edges just visible through the pines. The land was giving something up. Luther had the sudden, overwhelming sense that whatever lay buried beneath his property had been waiting a very long time to be found. And now that the storm had torn away its shroud, there would be no putting it back. The phone clicked. A woman's voice, distant and crackling. "Sheriff's office." Luther cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Luther Simmons, out on Old Bragg Road. I need to report." Well, I'm not rightly sure what to call it. The hurricane opened up a hole on my property, and there's something down there, something the Army might want to know about. A pause. What kind of something, Mr. Simmons? Luther looked out at the concrete tomb the earth had revealed. Something that wasn't supposed to be found. The morning after Hurricane Camille arrived in silence. Luther Simmons stood on his sagging porch at first light, surveying a landscape that had been rearranged by forces beyond his understanding. The storm had passed sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world reshaped by water and wind. His chicken coop listed at an angle that defied physics. The back pasture fence had simply vanished. Where the old hickory had stood for longer than Luther had been alive, there was now only a crater filled with muddy water. The air smelled wrong. Not just the familiar dampness of flood, but something mineral and ancient, like earth that hadn't tasted sunlight in generations. Luther was 67 years old, and this land had been in his family since his grandfather purchased it with money saved from 40 years of sharecropping. He knew every rise and hollow, every spring that bubbled up in wet seasons, every stone foundation where tenant shacks had stood before the Army bought up most of the surrounding acreage during the war. He'd walked this property line 1,000 times. But the thing Ezra was barking at, that was new. The blue-tick hound stood rigid near the back fence line, about 200 yards from the house, his whole body trembling with a tension Luther had never seen. Not the excited quiver of a coon treed or the aggressive stance of an intruder marked. This was something else. Fear, maybe, or recognition of something fundamentally wrong. "Ezra!" Luther called, his voice cracking across the stillness. "Get on back here!" The dog didn't move, just kept barking, that high, frantic sound that made Luther's skin prickle despite the August heat already building. Luther pulled on his work boots, still damp from yesterday's futile attempt to secure the outbuildings before the storm hit, and made his way across the saturated yard. His feet sank into earth that had turned to soup. Every step required effort, like wading through something that wanted to hold him back. As he got closer, he could see what had stopped Ezra cold. The land had opened. Where there should have been the gradual slope down to Rockfish Creek's tributary, there was now a sinkhole about 15 feet across. The hurricane's floodwaters had scoured away tons of topsoil and clay, exposing something that had been buried beneath Luther's property for longer than he'd owned it. Concrete. Gray and water-stained, but unmistakably man-made. Hard geometric edges jutting from the soft Carolina earth like broken teeth. Luther approached slowly, each step deliberate. Ezra had stopped barking but wouldn't come away from the edge, just stood there with his hackles raised and a low whine building in his throat. "Easy now," Luther murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. The sinkhole's edge was unstable, still crumbling where the storm had undermined it. Luther knelt carefully, testing the ground before putting his weight down. He peered into the opening. The morning sun slanted down at an angle that let him see perhaps 10 feet into the cavity. There was a ladder, iron rungs set into concrete, descending into darkness. The top rungs were rusted through, flaking orange in the humid air, but the lower ones looked solid enough. At the bottom of what he could see, maybe 20 feet down, there was a flat surface, a floor, and a door. Metal, from what Luther could tell, round, like a ship's hatch, with a wheel-lock mechanism in the center. His pulse quickened. This wasn't some old root cellar or forgotten well. This was military. Had to be. The concrete was too thick, the construction too deliberate. He'd seen enough Army Corps of Engineers work during the war years to recognize their signature. Those perfect right angles, that industrial precision. But there shouldn't be anything military on his land. His property predated Fort Bragg's expansions. His grandfather had the deed. The Army had tried to buy him out 3 times over the years, but Luther had refused. This was family ground. So what the hell was this? Ezra whined again, a sound almost human in its distress. The dog took 3 steps back from the hole, then forward again, as if caught between instinct to flee and duty to guard. Luther pulled himself up, brushing wet clay from his knees. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't say exactly why. It was just a bunker. Probably some old civil defense shelter from the 50s, something built during all that atomic bomb hysteria. Maybe the previous owners had put it in and never told anyone. Things got lost in paperwork all the time, especially in the rural registries. Except the concrete looked older than that, and it was deep, far deeper than any civilian would have dug. He thought about going down there. The ladder looked stable enough in the lower sections. He had a flashlight in the truck. Could take a quick look, see what was what, then decide whether to report it. But Ezra's reaction stopped him. Dogs knew things. Luther had learned that truth over decades of hunting these woods. When a hound refused to track, there was usually a reason. Snakes sometimes, sinkholes in the deeper swamp, places where the water ran strange and the ground couldn't be trusted, or something worse. Something that didn't have a name but registered in animal senses as fundamentally dangerous. Luther straightened, making his decision. He walked back to the house with deliberate calm, though his heartbeat hadn't slowed. Ezra followed reluctantly, looking back every few steps. Inside, Luther washed his hands at the kitchen pump, then picked up the telephone. It took 4 rings before someone at the county sheriff's office answered. "Sheriff's Department, Mary Ann speaking." "Morning, Mary Ann. This is Luther Simmons, out on the Old Bragg Road." "Mr. Simmons, you make it through the storm all right? We've been getting calls all morning about flooding and—" "I'm fine. House is fine. But I got something out here you folks might want to see." There was a pause. "What kind of something?" Luther chose his words carefully. "Storm washed out a big sinkhole on my back property. Exposed some kind of concrete structure. Looks military, maybe old civil defense. Got a metal door and everything. Figured the Army might want to know about it, seeing as it's right near their fence line." Another pause, longer this time. He could hear papers rustling, a muffled conversation with someone else in the office. "All right, Mr. Simmons. Deputy Carson is out your way checking storm damage. I'll radio him to swing by your place. You stay clear of it until he gets there. Hear?" "Yes, ma'am. Wasn't planning on exploring. Just thought somebody official should know." He hung up and stood at his kitchen window, looking out across the torn-up yard toward the fence line. From here, he couldn't see the sinkhole, just the post where Ezra had been standing. The dog was on the porch now, settled but watchful, facing that direction like he was standing guard. Luther made himself a pot of coffee and waited. Deputy Carson arrived 90 minutes later in a mud-splattered county truck, accompanied by Sheriff Wade himself, a surprise that told Luther this was being taken more seriously than he'd expected. "Luther," Sheriff Wade nodded, stepping carefully across the waterlogged yard. He was a heavy man in his 50s, with the slow, methodical manner of someone who'd learned not to rush to judgment. "Mary Ann said you found something?" "Out back. I'll show you." They walked in silence, Luther leading, the 2 officers following. Ezra stayed on the porch, which seemed to unsettle Deputy Carson more than anything else. "Your dog not coming?" the deputy asked. "No, sir. He won't go near it." The sheriff and deputy exchanged a glance Luther couldn't quite read. When they reached the sinkhole, both men stopped short. Sheriff Wade let out a low whistle. "Well, hell." They spent 10 minutes examining the site from every angle, peering down into the opening, testing the stability of the edges. Deputy Carson took photographs with a department camera. Neither man seemed eager to descend the ladder. "This on your property, Luther?" the sheriff finally asked. "Yes, sir. About 40 feet from the fence line by my measure. You ever see any paperwork about it? Previous owners mention anything?" "Not a word. Been in my family since 48. Before that it was the Hendricks place, and they never said nothing about no bunker." Sheriff Wade crouched at the edge playing his flashlight beam down the shaft. The light caught something that made him go still. "Carson, come look at this." The deputy joined him, following the beam. Luther could see it too, now that the angle was right. On the metal door, stenciled in faded military lettering, U.S. Army Restricted Authorized Personnel Only. Below that, smaller, Fort Bragg, Research Station. 7. Sheriff Wade stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. His face had gone carefully blank in a way that told Luther the man was thinking hard. "Luther, I'm going to ask you to go back to your house now. Don't mention this to anyone. We're going to make some calls." "Whose calls would those be?" "Fort Bragg, for starters. This is their installation, looks like. They'll want to send someone." Luther nodded slowly. "All right. But Sheriff, what is it you think this is?" Wade looked at him for a long moment. "Honestly, I don't know. But whatever it is, it's been hidden a long time. Maybe there's a good reason for that." Luther walked back to his house feeling the weight of those words. Behind him, he could hear the sheriff on his radio, his voice low and urgent. On the porch, Ezra was still watching the fence line. The dog's whole body was tense, ears forward, as if listening to something only he could hear, something underground, something that had been waiting in the dark for 17 years. Luther sat down in his rocker and waited for the army to arrive. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up mud along the rutted drive to Luther Simmons's property, followed by 2 army sedans that looked obscenely clean against the storm-ravaged landscape. Sheriff Wade emerged first, his mouth a tight line as he surveyed the sinkhole that had opened like a wound in the earth. Behind him, 2 officers in crisp uniforms stepped carefully over fallen branches. Captain Morris wore the expression of a man who'd been called away from Sunday dinner. His companion, Lieutenant Havers, carried a Geiger counter that clicked softly in the humid air. "Mr. Simmons says it's about 20 feet down," Wade explained, directing his flashlight into the opening. "Concrete structure, military markings." Morris leaned over the edge, peering at the iron ladder rungs that descended into darkness. "This whole area was supposed to be surveyed in '54, he muttered. "Nothing like this was on the maps." "Maybe it wasn't supposed to be," Havers said quietly. They descended one at a time, their boots ringing hollow on the metal rungs. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying a smell that made Wade's nose wrinkle. Not decay, but something older. Abandonment. Sealed time. The bottom opened into a corridor carved from poured concrete, wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast. Their flashlight beams caught stenciled letters on the wall. Fort Bragg, Research Station 7. Authorized personnel only. 1943. "Sweet Jesus," Wade whispered. They moved forward, boots scuffing on grit that had once been dirt tracked in by other men. The first chamber yawned before them like the nave of some terrible church. 42 rucksacks stood in perfect formation. Morris stopped so abruptly that Havers nearly walked into him. The packs were arranged in parade ground precision, 4 rows of 10 with 2 centered at the front. Each one sat upright despite 17 years in the dark, as if the men who'd carried them might return at any moment to reclaim them. "Mother of God," Havers breathed. Wade's light found the dog tags first, a long line of them hanging from a water pipe that ran along the ceiling, each set separated by exactly 6 inches. The metal glinted dully, names stamped in alphabetical order. Ashworth, Daniel T. Cole, Raymond H. Torres, Michael A. The sheriff counted, 42 sets. "They knew they weren't leaving," Morris said, his voice strange and tight. "They hung their tags like they were checking into somewhere permanent." Havers had moved to examine the rucksacks. With gloved hands he opened the nearest one. Inside, neatly folded, a spare uniform, socks, a Bible with a name written in careful script on the first page. A photograph of a young woman holding a baby fell from between the pages. "Everything's preserved," he reported. "The air down here, it's cool, dry, like a crypt." They found the weapons stacked against the far wall with military precision. 42 M1 Garands, each one field-stripped, cleaned, and laid out with its components arranged just so. No ammunition, not a single round. "Disarmed themselves," Wade observed, or someone disarmed them. A doorway led deeper. Morris hesitated before crossing the threshold, some instinct making him reluctant to disturb whatever lay beyond. But duty pulled him forward. The second chamber had been living quarters. Bedrolls lay in neat rows along both walls, and in the corner, someone had constructed a latrine using lumber and a bucket. Empty ration tins sat in a careful pyramid, labels still legible. U.S. Army. Ration Type C, 1951. "They were down here for days," Havers said, examining the tins. "Maybe a week, but it was the walls that held their attention. Someone had used a knife or bayonet to carve directly into the concrete, words scratched out with desperate precision. Day 3. LT says enemy approaching, ordered inside for defensive position. RC Day 4, tried to leave, he won't let us. Drew weapon, says we're compromised. RC Day 5, Ashworth tried to stop him. Oh, God. RC. The letters RC appeared again and again, each entry more frantic than the last. Wade pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipped back through his notes from the 1952 investigation. SSG Raymond Cole. Wife Sarah, residing Valdosta. Cole was second in command, Morris confirmed, reading over his shoulder. He was trying to document what was happening. The entries continued down the wall, the handwriting growing shakier. Day 6. He says we're infected. He says the colonel told him. There is no colonel. We're alone with him. Day 7. He's going to save the world. Tell Sarah I tried. The sentence ended mid-word, the final letter trailing off into a scratch that looked like the knife had been torn from Cole's hand. Havers had found something else. He stood before a section of wall where someone had attempted to scratch a calendar, 7 vertical lines carefully grouped. After that, frantic hash marks covered the concrete. Someone had lost count, or lost the will to count, but it was what Morris discovered that made them all fall silent. A wedding band hammered into the concrete like a nail. The force required to drive gold into solid concrete spoke of either superhuman strength or mechanical assistance, but the result was unmistakable. The ring had been embedded deliberately, left as a marker or a message. Wade leaned close, reading the inscription inside. Raymond and Sarah, June 1947. He knew he wasn't coming home, the sheriff said quietly. He left her a gravestone. A steel door waited at the chamber's far end. Unlike the others, this one was closed, its wheel lock handle turned to the sealed position. Stenciled letters read Level 3, Containment. Morris reached for the handle, then paused. "Lieutenant, what's that counter reading?" Havers checked the Geiger. "Background radiation, normal levels. Whatever was down here, it's not hot." "Not anymore," Wade corrected. Morris gripped the wheel. It resisted at first, rust and time binding it shut, but he put his weight into it and the mechanism groaned. The seal broke with a sound like a sigh, as if the room beyond had been holding its breath for 17 years. The door swung open. Sheriff Wade had seen death. Car wrecks on Highway 401, farm accidents, the occasional hunting mishap. But nothing had prepared him for the geometry of what lay in the circular chamber beyond. His flashlight beam found them one at a time, adding to the count. Skeletal remains in rotted uniforms, arranged in 3 concentric circles. The outer ring held 20 men. The middle ring held another 20. In the center, alone, facing outward with a service pistol near the bones of his right hand, sat what had once been First Lieutenant Jacob Mercer. Every skull bore the same mark, a neat, circular hole at the base, where the spine met the brain. Every one except Mercer's. His showed the contact wound under the jaw, the characteristic exit pattern through the top of the cranium. "Execution," Havers whispered. "He lined them up and—" "Or they lined up," Morris interrupted, his voice hollow. "Look at the spacing. Look at the precision. That's not panic. That's not chaos." He was right. The circles were perfect, each skeleton positioned with its back to the center. They'd knelt facing away from their commander while he moved from man to man with methodical care. The physical evidence suggested compliance, not struggle. Most of the bones showed no defensive wounds. "Why would they?" Wade asked, though he knew no answer would satisfy. Why would 41 men just kneel there and let him? Because he was their officer, Morris said, and they were trained to obey. But it was what waited on the wall that transformed horror into something worse, something that suggested the nightmare had never truly ended. Havers's light found it first. Writing, large and crude, applied in a dark substance that forensics would later confirm as blood mixed with the iron-rich soil from above. The letters were 2 feet tall, carved and painted with terrible care. They followed me home. I brought them inside. I couldn't let them out. Wade's hands shook. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had never felt the presence of evil as a tangible thing. But here, in this tomb of perfect circles and patient death, something lingered. The residue of a mind that had broken so completely it had taken 41 others with it into the dark. "We need to get topside," Morris managed. We need a forensics team, a chaplain. Christ, we need—" His light had drifted down and he stopped mid-sentence. Scratched into the concrete floor, directly in front of Mercer's remains, was a single word repeated over and over in tight, obsessive script. Safe, 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 safe. He thought he was protecting them, Havers said, and his voice cracked. He thought he was keeping them safe. They climbed out in silence, each man carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. At the surface, Luther Simmons waited on his porch with his hound, both of them keeping vigil over the hole in the earth. "You found them," Luther said. Not a question. Morris nodded, unable to speak. "The ground been holding that secret a long time," the old farmer observed. "Took a hurricane to make it let go. Some things don't want to stay buried." As the Army officers radioed for support, forensic teams, CID investigators, chaplains, and the grim machinery of official response. Sheriff Wade stood at the edge of the sinkhole and thought about Sarah Cole, about all the wives and mothers who'd spent 17 years wondering Luther Simmons stood in the dirt yard of his farmhouse, watching the Army vehicles roll in like a slow funeral procession. First came the sheriff's cruiser, dust rising from its tires. Behind it, 2 unmarked sedans and a flatbed truck carrying equipment he couldn't name. Generators, tripods, cases stenciled with military markings. Men in pressed uniforms emerged, faces set with the particular grimness of people who'd been briefed on what awaited below. He recognized Sheriff Wade's heavy tread on the gravel. Behind him came a man in captain's bars and another carrying sealed cases. They'd brought more than a team. They'd brought witnesses, documentation, the full machinery of official discovery. "Mr. Simmons?" The captain extended a hand. "Captain Robert Morris, Criminal Investigation Division. You've done your country a service today." Luther's calloused palm met the captain's. "Didn't do nothing but make a phone call." "That was enough." Morris gestured toward the sinkhole, where yellow caution tape now fluttered in the morning breeze. "The entrance is secure?" "Ain't touched it since yesterday. My hound won't go near it." Morris glanced at Ezra, who sat pressed against Luther's leg, hackles raised despite the distance. The dog tracked the movements of every man with the whites of his eyes showing. "Animals, no," one of the technicians muttered, unloading a case. "Animals know what?" Morris's tone carried warning. "Nothing, sir, just saying." Within the hour, they'd established a perimeter. Floodlights on tripods surrounded the sinkhole, cables snaking back to the humming generator. 2 investigators descended first, their headlamps creating moving circles of light against concrete walls. Then Morris followed, his polished boots disappearing rung by rung into the earth. Luther stayed topside, as instructed. He sat on his porch with Ezra, watching men ferry equipment down and photographs up. Young soldiers stationed at the perimeter kept their backs to the hole, as if the darkness might reach out and claim them. The morning stretched toward noon. A medical examiner's van arrived, parking at a respectful distance. Then an Army chaplain, his collar visible beneath his uniform jacket. That told Luther everything about what they'd found. Below ground, Captain Morris stood in the chamber Sheriff Wade had described, but the briefing hadn't prepared him for the scale. The Level 1 storage area extended 50 feet in each direction, support pillars marking perfect intervals. His flashlight beam swept across the 42 rucksacks, their spacing so precise they could have been awaiting inspection. "Jesus Christ," Lieutenant Havers whispered beside him. "Document. Everything." Morris's voice came out harder than he'd intended. "Photos from every angle. I want measurements, sketches, the works." A forensic photographer began his methodical circuit, flash units popping in rapid succession. Each burst illuminated details Morris wished remained hidden, the careful arrangement suggesting ceremony, the dog tags hanging like wind chimes from the overhead pipe, the names catching light. Ashworth, Daniel T. Cole, Raymond H. Torres, Michael A. Morris paused at Torres's tag, remembering the transcript of the final transmission. The kid had tried to warn them. "Sir," a technician called from the living quarters entrance, "you need to see the writings." The concrete walls bore the chronicle Sheriff Wade had mentioned, but reading the full text created a narrative more disturbing than Morris had imagined. The words were carved with desperate precision, some letters shallower where the implement had dulled or the carver's strength had failed. Day 3. Lieutenant ordered us inside. Says enemy movement detected. No contact with base. Raymond. Day 4. Still underground. Lieutenant won't explain. Men asking questions. He drew his weapon when Private Morrison suggested topside recon. Raymond. Day 5. Lieutenant shot Private Ashworth today. Said he was infected. Said we're all infected. God help us. Raymond. Morris's jaw tightened. He photographed each entry, the camera's shutter sound obscenely loud in the dead air. Day 6. He talks to someone who isn't here. A colonel gives him orders. We tried. The entry ended mid-word, the final letter trailing down the wall. Captain. Havers stood by Cole's wedding ring, still embedded in the concrete. I called Fort Polk. They have a Sarah Cole listed as next of kin for SSG Raymond Cole. Valdosta, Georgia. She's 52 now. Widow. Hold that notification. Morris stared at the ring, hammered in with such force the band had deformed. Until we know exactly what we're telling her. The Level 2 chambers revealed habitation patterns, where men had slept, where they'd rationed food, where they'd tried to maintain human dignity in a tomb. Empty ration tins stacked by type and date, a makeshift latrine sectioned off by hung canvas, bedrolls arranged in rows, still indented where bodies had lain 17 years ago. The calendar scratched into the wall showed 7 careful marks, then frantic scratches suggesting someone had lost count, or sanity, or both. Sir, we're ready for Level 3. The lead investigator stood by the sealed containment door, bolt cutters in hand. Morris nodded. Every man present checked his respirator, though they'd already confirmed normal air quality. The Geiger counter clicked its steady rhythm, background radiation, nothing more. But the weight pressing down on them had nothing to do with contamination you could measure. The door's wheel lock resisted, rust fighting against the cutters. Metal shrieked. Then the seal broke with a rush of air that smelled of dust and something. Underneath, something Morris couldn't name but recognized from Korea, from villages cleared too late. The chamber beyond measured 40 feet across, a perfect circle lit by their collective flashlight beams. The photographer moved forward, his flash firing once, twice, 3 times. Morris had seen death. He'd processed crime scenes, documented casualties, filed reports that reduced human tragedy to bureaucratic language. Nothing prepared him for the geometry of this. 41 skeletons in concentric rings, each one seated with its back to the center. The uniforms had largely decayed, but belts and boots remained, creating the outline of men who'd sat in disciplined formation even in death. Every skull bore the same wound, a single hole at the base, execution style, the bullets themselves long since absorbed into the concrete or carried away by whoever had fired them. In the center, facing outward, Lieutenant Jacob Mercer. His skeleton sat with one hand extended, as if reaching for the service pistol that lay 3 feet away. The weapon's chamber gaped empty. His skull showed a different wound pattern. The bullet had entered beneath the chin, angled upward. "Count them," Morris ordered, though his voice barely carried. 41 surrounding, 1 center, 42 total. The photographer's next flash illuminated the wall behind Mercer, and Morris saw the message Sheriff Wade had mentioned. But here, in person, the words carried a weight the transcript couldn't capture. They'd been written in something dark that had dried to brown. Blood mixed with dirt or soil, maybe tears. They followed me home. I brought them inside. I couldn't let them out. Below it, scratched into the floor in a circle around Mercer's remains, one word repeated obsessively. Safe, 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 safe. He thought he was protecting them, Havers said quietly, or protecting the world from them. Morris knelt beside Mercer's skeleton, examining the positioning. The lieutenant had sat here for hours, maybe days after the killings, before placing the gun beneath his chin. Food wrappers nearby suggested he'd outlived his men, consuming their rations in the darkness. A technician called from the wall. "Sir, there's more writing, smaller, different hand." Morris joined him. Someone had used a nail or rock to scratch nearly invisible words into the concrete, low and to the left of Mercer's message. "Tell my wife I tried to stop him. Tell her I'm sorry I failed. R." Raymond Cole's final testament, hidden where only someone looking closely would find it. "Get samples of everything," Morris said. "The writing substance, bone fragments, uniform remnants, spent shell casings. I want toxicology, forensics, the full battery." "Sir?" The photographer lowered his camera. How do we explain this?" "We don't explain. We document." But even as Morris said it, he knew they'd have to try. The families deserved more than photographs and measurements. They deserved to understand how 42 men had vanished into the earth and died at the hands of the officer sworn to lead them. Topside, Luther watched the first body bag emerge. Then another, and another. The procession continued through the afternoon. Each black bag handled with military precision, loaded onto the truck with ceremony despite the horror of what lay inside. Captain Morris surfaced near sunset, his uniform dusty, his face aged. He approached Luther's porch slowly. "Mr. Simmons, I need to ask you to keep what you've seen here confidential, for now." "Figured as much." Luther scratched Ezra's ears. "Those boys been down there since '52? That's what we believe. And they ain't been resting easy." Morris studied the old man. "What makes you say that?" "Ground didn't want them found. Took a hurricane to tear the earth open." Luther spat tobacco juice into the yard. "My daddy used to say land remembers, holds on to things. This land's been holding on to something bad a long time. Project Sentinel." Morris didn't phrase it as a question. "You know about it?" "Know the Army had a facility out here during the war. Know they shut it down quick and buried the records quicker. My daddy worked clearing crews in '46. Said the men who came out of that bunker had a look about them, like they'd seen things that weren't meant to be seen." "Did he ever mention what kind of research they conducted?" Luther shook his head. "Daddy didn't talk about it. Took whatever he knew to the grave in '63, but I remember him saying once that some doors ought to stay closed, some holes ought to stay filled." The archivist's hands trembled as she pulled the folder from the shelf. Dust motes swirled in the dim light of the National Archives basement, settling on Margaret Talbot's reading glasses as she stared at the stamp across the manila cover. Top secret. Project Sentinel. Decommissioned 1945. She'd worked in classified military records for 23 years, since just after the war, and she knew the weight of forgotten things. The call had come from Fort Bragg 3 hours ago. A lieutenant colonel, somebody or other, voice tight with urgency, demanding she search for any documentation related to a facility near Rockfish Creek, North Carolina. Research Station 7. The name had meant nothing to her until she'd checked the card catalog, following a trail of cross-references through WAPU-2 chemical weapons programs, and found this single folder misfiled under agricultural projects from 1943. Now, alone in the climate-controlled vault beneath Pennsylvania Avenue, Margaret opened it. The first page was a project overview dated March 1942. She read the clinical language with growing unease. Development and field testing of aerosolized psychoactive compounds for deployment in contested civilian populations. Objective: induce paranoia, distrust of authority, and psychological breakdown in enemy forces without conventional weapons. A photograph. Slipped free, a concrete bunker emerging from red Carolina clay, surrounded by men in hazmat suits that looked primitive by modern standards. She turned the page. Test subject logs. Volunteer soldiers from Fort Bragg, subjected to graduated exposure levels. The results were documented with detached precision. Subject 7 exhibited extreme agitation and accused handlers of being enemy infiltrators. Subject 12 barricaded himself in the observation room for 6 hours, convinced his commanding officers had been replaced by imposters. Subject 19 attempted to strangle a medic, claiming he could see insects beneath the man's skin. The program ran from 1942 through late 1944, when an incident report halted all testing. Margaret's throat tightened as she read, 3 subjects experienced permanent psychotic breaks following exposure to compound S-17, unable to be rehabilitated, transferred to psychiatric facility in Virginia. Project Sentinel, decommissioned by order of War Department, January 1945. Facility sealed and stricken from operational maps. The final page was a decontamination report. The bunker had been flushed with neutralizing agents, all samples destroyed, all records classified. But a handwritten note in the margin, initialed and dated 1947, caught her eye. Trace compounds may remain stable in enclosed concrete environments for extended periods. Recommend permanent closure and monitoring. Margaret removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She thought of the lieutenant colonel's voice, the barely controlled horror when he'd mentioned 42 skeletons arranged in a circle. The phone on the wall jangled. She crossed the vault and lifted the receiver. "Talbot, this is Lieutenant Colonel Morris, Fort Bragg, CID. Did you locate the files?" "I have them." She glanced back at the folder on the table. "Colonel, what exactly was found at this site?" A long pause. "Evidence suggesting a decorated combat veteran may have held his platoon in a decommissioned chemical facility and executed them in 1952. We're trying to understand why." Margaret's fingers tightened on the handset. "When was the bunker last inspected?" "According to our records, it was never inspected. We had no documentation it existed." "Then no one tested residual contamination levels." Another pause, longer this time. "Residual what?" She told him, every word from the decontamination report, every clinical notation about permanent psychotic breaks and command hallucinations. When she finished, Morris didn't speak for several seconds. "How long could these compounds remain active?" "The notes suggest indefinitely in the right conditions. Sealed concrete, minimal air exchange, cool temperatures." She heard papers rustling on his end. "Colonel, do you know if the bunker showed signs of habitation?" "A week's worth. Empty rations, makeshift latrine, wall carvings indicating the commanding officer believed they were surrounded by enemies, that his men were infected with something." The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. Margaret thought of those test subjects from 1943, soldiers who'd breathed experimental fear and never recovered. Then she thought of a young lieutenant, traumatized from Korea, leading his men into that same poisoned air 17 years later. "There's something else," Morris said. "The officer who led them inside, First Lieutenant Jacob Mercer. I pulled his service jacket. He was flagged for psychological evaluation in 1951. Severe paranoia, command hallucinations. The examining psychiatrist recommended immediate discharge and treatment. Was he discharged? No. Personnel command overruled it. Korea was heating up. We needed experienced officers." Morris's voice carried the weight of institutional failure. "The evaluation is stamped "Subject cleared for duty by someone 3 levels above the examining doctor." Margaret looked at the photograph again, at the men in their inadequate suits working around a bunker that should have stayed buried. "Colonel, I need to send you these files immediately. But there's one more thing you should know." "Go ahead." "The final page references a follow-up inspection that was scheduled for 1950 but never conducted due to budget constraints. Someone was supposed to verify complete decontamination." She traced the handwritten note with her finger. "It was never done. For 7 years, that facility sat there, sealed but not safe, waiting for someone to open it." My God. In the silence that followed, Margaret heard typing in the background, voices conferring. Morris cleared his throat. "Miss Talbot, how fast can you get those files to North Carolina?" "I can have them on tonight's courier flight to Fort Bragg." She began gathering the papers, handling them like the evidence they were. "But, Colonel, this doesn't explain everything, does it? Even with chemical exposure, what would make a man execute 41 soldiers?" "I don't know. We're still trying to understand the timeline. The wall carving suggests it happened over several days, a gradual deterioration." He exhaled slowly. "There's one detail that bothers me more than the others." Margaret waited. "The skeletons show execution-style wounds. Single shots to the back of the head, very precise, but the carved messages indicate chaos, paranoia, desperation. The two don't match. It's almost like there were 2 different people, one writing those frantic warnings, another conducting methodical executions." A chill crept down Margaret's spine. She thought of the test subjects, the way the reports described personality fragmentation, soldiers who stopped recognizing themselves in mirrors. "The compound was designed to fragment trust," she said quietly, "to make you doubt everyone around you, including yourself. What if Lieutenant Mercer wasn't just paranoid about his men? What if he stopped trusting his own judgment, his own memories? You're suggesting he might have, what, blacked out? During the killings?" "I'm suggesting the man who led them into that bunker may not have been the same man who pulled the trigger." She closed the folder. "The research notes mention dissociative episodes in severe cases. Subjects would have lucid moments where they recognized what they'd done, then slip back into paranoia." Morris was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was subdued. "One of the wall carvings was from the sergeant, Raymond Cole. He wrote, 'He says we're infected. He says he's saving the world.' Present tense, like Mercer was still talking to them as it happened. Talking or rationalizing? I don't know anymore." Margaret secured the folder with a string, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind raced through implications. A decorated officer, already damaged by war, breathing poison in a forgotten bunker, leading men who trusted him into darkness, then turning that trust into a tomb. "Colonel, when you brief the families, we haven't decided how much to tell them. Knowing there might be a chemical explanation doesn't make it easier, doesn't bring them back." He paused. 41 men followed orders into that bunker because that's what soldiers do. They trusted their commander, and that trust killed them. She thought of Sarah Cole in Valdosta, waiting 17 years for answers. Of Congressman Ashworth and all the others, finally learning their sons had died not in training accidents or heroic combat, but executed in a dark hole by a man whose mind had been broken twice, once by war, once by his own government's abandoned weapons. "Send the files," Morris said. "And, Miss Talbot, this stays classified. The chemical weapons program, all of it. The families will be told it was a psychotic break, nothing more. But they deserve peace, not the knowledge that we poisoned our own bunker and forgot about it." His voice hardened. "This conversation never happened. Project Sentinel stays buried." Margaret looked at the folder in her hands. She thought about adding her own note to the margins, something to mark the truth for future researchers. But she'd worked in classified records long enough to know how thoroughly secrets could be kept. "Understood, sir." She hung up and carried the folder to the courier desk, watching as it was logged and sealed in a diplomatic pouch. By morning, it would reach Fort Bragg. By afternoon, investigators would have the clinical vocabulary to explain what Lieutenant Jacob Mercer had breathed, what had wormed into his mind and convinced him his own men were the enemy. But they would never release it. The families would receive redacted reports and sealed coffins and the comfort of believing it was just madness, just war trauma, just one damaged man who'd taken his platoon with him into darkness. Margaret returned to the vault and checked the card catalog. Project Sentinel had only the one folder, now in transit, but cross-references led to other programs, other bunkers, other experiments conducted in the desperate years when America fought enemies abroad and created new ones in laboratories. She pulled files until midnight, reading by lamplight, learning the scope of what had been tested and abandoned across the country. Chemical compounds designed to break mines, facilities sealed without proper decontamination. Soldiers who'd volunteered to breathe experimental fear, never knowing it might never leave them. At her bus stop on Constitution Avenue, waiting in the November cold, Margaret thought about Luther Simmons and his blue-tick hound. How the Earth had kept that secret for 17 years until a hurricane tore it open. How some truths stayed buried until the fluorescent lights in the Army Forensics Laboratory hummed with a persistence that grated on Captain Robert Morris's nerves. He'd slept 3 hours in the past 48, sustained by black coffee and the terrible momentum of discovery. Now, standing before a wall of projected images, he wondered if understanding the truth was worse than not knowing. Specialist Alan Crawford adjusted the projector, cycling through high-resolution photographs of the bunker's concrete walls. Each image captured scratches and gouges in the surface, crude letters carved with desperate force. "Day 1 entries start here," Crawford said, indicating faint markings near what had been the living quarters. "Handwriting analysis confirms this is Staff Sergeant Cole's work. The deeper grooves suggest he used a knife blade or metal implement." Morris leaned closer. The words were crude but legible. "OSID 17. LT says enemy movement nearby. Ordered inside for defensive position. Men confused but compliant. Sealed entrance at 2100 hours. October 17th, Morris repeated. "That matches Torres's radio transmission. Continue." Crawford advanced the slides. The next entry showed more agitation in the carving strokes. Day 2. No contact topside. LT won't explain strategy. Rations adequate. Morale declining. Ashworth questioned orders. LT drew weapon. Situation contained. Around the lab, the assembled investigators exchanged glances. Major Reeves, who'd flown in from Washington, cleared his throat. So, Mercer was already threatening his own men by day 2. "It escalates," Crawford said quietly, advancing again. Day 3. "LT claims we're compromised. Says enemy agents among us. Checked weapons. All accounted for. All unloaded per his order yesterday." Growing unrest. Morrison tried exit hatch, sealed from outside. "We are trapped." Morris felt his jaw tighten. The timeline was becoming horrifically clear. Mercer hadn't led them underground as shelter. He'd led them into a tomb of his own design. The next image showed writing that was harder to decipher, the letters overlapping. Day 4, maybe 5, lost count. LT executing security interviews one by one in sealed room. Men terrified. He says infection spreading. Talks to someone not. Here, calls him Colonel. No food since yesterday. Ashworth planning intervention. "Notice the deterioration in Cole's handwriting," Crawford pointed out. "The pressure's uneven, letters malformed. He was either exhausted, starving, or terrified," Morris finished. "What's next?" The following photograph showed a different section of wall, the letters shallow and hurried. Ashworth dead. LT shot him. Said he was the primary vector. We are hostages. God help us. The lab fell silent except for the projector's mechanical whir. Morris thought of Congressman Ashworth, now Senator Ashworth, who'd spent 17 years believing his son had simply vanished. This was going to destroy him. "Is that the last entry?" Reeves asked. Crawford shook his head. There's one more. It's not complete. The final image appeared on the wall. The carving was jagged, frantic, the letters barely legible. He says we're infected. He says he's saving the world. God forgive us for following orders. Tell Sarah I tried. The sentence ended mid-word, the final dash trailing off into unmarked concrete. Morris closed his eyes. Sarah Cole, 52 years old, living in Valdosta with 17 years of unanswered questions. He was going to have to tell her that her husband had spent his final moments carving her name into a wall while waiting to be executed by a man he'd trusted. "Can we determine when this was written?" Morris asked. Crawford consulted his notes. "Based on the forensic timeline and the reference to Ashworth's death, we estimate October 23rd or 24th. The execution of the remaining men occurred within hours of this carving. Cole's remains were found in the third row of the circular formation, one of the last to die based on skeletal positioning." "So he knew," Reeves said. "He knew what was coming, and he tried to leave her a message." Morris turned to the evidence table where they'd cataloged everything from the bunker. Cole's wedding ring sat in a clear plastic bag, the inscription still visible. Raymond and Sarah, June 1947. 5 years of marriage before Korea. 7 years before the bunker. "There's something else," Crawford said hesitantly. "We found additional carvings, scattered across different walls, different areas. We think multiple men tried to leave records." He cycled through several more images. A section near the weapons cache read, "PFC Torres. Tried to warn them." LT stopped transmission. "I'm sorry, Mom." Another, near the sealed door, "Morrison here. October 20th or 22. He's making us line up. Says it's medical inspection. Don't believe him." The dates aligned with Cole's entries, creating a mosaic of final moments. Morris felt the weight of it pressing down on him. 41 voices crying out from concrete, desperate to be remembered, to be understood. Were any of them? Reeves paused, choosing words carefully. Did any of them resist? "Forensics found defensive wounds on 4 skeletons," Crawford said. "Bone fractures consistent with hand-to-hand combat. But most showed no signs of struggle. We think Mercer executed them while they were compliant, possibly convincing them it was medical procedure or mercy." Morris thought of the journal entries Lieutenant Colonel Vance had shown him from Cole's recovered letters. The men trust him because he's an officer. They don't see what I see. "Show me Mercer's writing," Morris said. Crawford projected a new series of images. The contrast was immediate. Where Cole's carvings were desperate but organized, Mercer's were manic, overlapping, obsessive. The chamber wall behind where his skeleton had been found was covered in a single phrase repeated hundreds of times. "Safe, safe, 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 safe." He carved that after killing them, Crawford explained. Probably over days. The depth of the grooves varies wildly. Some barely scratched the surface, others went deep enough to chip the concrete. We found traces of blood and tissue in several of the deeper marks. The largest message, written in what forensics had confirmed was a mixture of blood and sediment, dominated the wall. "They followed me home. I brought them inside. I couldn't let them out." "They being the platoon?" Reeves asked. "Or something he believed the platoon carried," Morris said. "Remember the Project Sentinel file. The compounds were designed to induce paranoid delusions about infection and infiltration. Mercer wasn't seeing soldiers. He was seeing contaminated vectors who would spread to the base, to the country." Crawford advanced to a close-up of a section near Mercer's remains. The writing was smaller here, almost conversational. "Colonel says this is the only way. Colonel says I'm the last defense. Colonel says they'll understand someday." "But there was no colonel," Reeves said. "Not in that bunker," Morris agreed. "But in Mercer's mind, he was real enough to give orders, real enough to justify mass murder." The lab's fluorescent lights flickered, casting momentary shadows across the projected images. Morris stared at the words carved by dying men and wondered about the ones who'd left no messages. The 18-year-old recruit's too terrified or too trusting to leave a final record. "There's one anomaly," Crawford said, pulling out a separate folder. "We found this carved in a ventilation shaft, different handwriting from Cole or Mercer." The image showed shaky letters, barely visible. "If anyone finds this, PFC Michael Torres was here. October 24th. I made it out. Tell my mother I tried to save them." Morris and Reeves exchanged sharp glances. "Torres survived?" "This was carved near the eastern air shaft," Crawford explained. "The one that emerged 300 yards from the main entrance. It's narrow, barely 18 inches wide, but it leads up." "Do we have confirmation of death on Torres?" Morris demanded. Reeves flipped through his files. "His dog tags were with the others. His rucksack was in formation, but his skeleton—" He paused. "Forensics identified 41 bodies plus Mercer. 42 total. If Torres was on the roster, we should have 43. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Morris felt his pulse quicken. Pull Torres's family records, current address, next of kin, employment history. If he survived, he's been living under our noses for 17 years, Reeves finished. Morris turned back to the wall of photographs. 41 men had died in that bunker, their final words preserved in concrete. But one man had escaped with the full story of what happened, and he'd chosen silence. The question was why. Crawford pulled out one final image. "There's something else. We almost missed it because it's carved into the ceiling above where Mercer's body was found. Someone had to stand on something to reach it." The photograph showed letters etched in a perfect, unnaturally steady hand. "The infection is contained. The mission is complete. Fort Bragg is safe." "That's Mercer's handwriting," Crawford confirmed. "Written after the executions, before his suicide. He believed, right up to the end, that he'd saved everyone." Morris thought of Lieutenant Jacob Mercer at 28, decorated for bravery at Chosin Reservoir, recommended for psychiatric treatment, and cleared for duty anyway. A man who'd seen hell in Korea and brought it home, who'd been handed 41 lives to lead and had led them into an underground tomb because his broken mind told him it was salvation. "Compile everything," Morris ordered. "Every carving, every word, every analysis. The families deserve to know their last thoughts. Even if those thoughts are—" Crawford trailed off. "Especially then," Morris said. "These men died following orders from a man they trusted. The least we can do is let them speak now." As the lab team began organizing the evidence, Morris stood alone before the projected image of Cole's final message. "Tell Sarah I tried." 5 words carved with a knife blade in concrete. The last Sarah Cole stands on her front porch in Valdosta, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a telegram she can barely read through her tears. The Western Union envelope trembles against her palm, the paper already worn from repeated folding and unfolding in the 3 hours since the Army chaplain delivered it. Regret to inform. Remains of Staff Sergeant Raymond H. Cole, identified. Stop recovered August 19, 1969, North Carolina. Stop details to follow. Stop she'd known. Some part of her had always known Raymond wasn't coming home. But 17 years of not knowing had left room for impossible hopes. Prisoner camps in Korea, amnesia, some fantastical scenario where he'd walk up the driveway one evening with an explanation that made sense. The telegram transformed 17 years of maybe into the iron weight of never. Inside, the telephone rings. It's been ringing all morning. The Ashworths call from Washington. Rita Torres from New Jersey, her key voice breaking. Families she hasn't spoken to in years, all connected by the same terrible thread. 42 men who marched into North Carolina pine forest in October 1952 and vanished like smoke. Sarah lets the calls go unanswered. She can't speak yet, can't form words around the questions burning in her throat. Where was he? How did he die? Why did it take 17 years? The August sun beats down on the neat suburban street. children playing stickball 3 houses over, a lawnmower droning in the distance. The normalcy of it feels obscene. In Raleigh, Luther Simmons sits across from Captain Robert Morris in a borrowed Fort Bragg office, his weathered hands folded on the table between them. Morris has been asking the same questions for an hour, circling back like a dog worrying a bone. "And you'd never seen any sign of the bunker before?" "No, sir." Luther's voice is patient, unhurried. "My daddy bought that land in '48. We walked every inch of it. Nothing but scrub pine and blackberry thicket back where the sinkhole opened up." Morris makes another note. His pen scratches loudly in the quiet room. "The hurricane exposed it? Tore the ground right open, 20 feet down to concrete." Luther shifts in the metal chair. "My hound Ezra won't go near it now. Just sets back and howls. Animals sense things," Morris says absently, then seems to catch himself. "I mean, disturbances in the earth, unstable ground." Luther doesn't contradict him, but his expression suggests he knows what the captain really meant. "Mr. Simmons, what we found down there," Morris stops, choosing his words. "It's going to be in the newspapers soon. When it is, you're going to have reporters on your property, maybe for weeks." "Already thought of that." Luther meets his eyes. "I can handle curious folks. What I can't handle is not knowing. Those boys been under my land all this time? 17 years, and I've been walking over them?" Morris nods slowly. "Since October 1952, we believe they were—" He pauses again. "They were placed there intentionally, by their commanding officer." The silence stretches long. "The one in the middle," Luther says quietly. "The one facing all the others. That him?" "Yes." "What made a man do that?" It's not really a question. Luther's eyes are distant, seeing something Morris can't. "My daddy used to say this land had a memory. The Creek people knew it, left it alone. Then the government came in the '40s, built things, buried things. Daddy said they didn't understand you can't just cover up bad ground and expect it to stay quiet." Morris wants to dismiss this as superstition, but something stops him. He thinks of Lieutenant Mercer's wall writings, the obsessive repetition of safe, the blood-scrawled delusion about contamination. He thinks of Project Sentinel, the compounds designed to fracture human minds. "We're still investigating the circumstances," he says instead. Luther stands, his chair scraping back. "You find what you need to find, Captain. I'll keep folks off the land, but I'm telling you, that place wanted to stay buried. Took a hurricane to pull it open." He heads for the door, then turns back. "Whatever was down there, it wasn't just those soldiers' bodies. You felt it too. I seen it in your face when you came up." After Luther leaves, Morris sits alone in the office. The forensics reports are stacked on his desk. Toxicology pending, ballistics complete, dental identifications confirmed. 42 men, 41 executed with clinical precision, 1 self-inflicted. He pulls out the photographs from the chamber. The skeletal remains arranged in their terrible circles. Mercer in the center, the pistol near his right hand. The wall behind him covered in those desperate, deteriorating words. His telephone buzzes. The base operator. "Captain Morris, I have a Mrs. Sarah Cole calling. She's requesting information about her husband." Morris closes his eyes. This is the part he's been dreading. The part where he has to tell a widow not just that her husband is dead, but how he died. Trapped underground, slowly starving, watching his commanding officer descend into madness, waiting for a bullet he must have known was coming. "Put her through." The line clicks. "Mrs. Cole? This is Captain Robert Morris, Criminal Investigation Division. I'm very sorry for your loss." Her voice is steady, but he can hear the steel control beneath it. "I want to know what happened to Raymond. Not the telegram version, the truth." Morris looks at the photographs spread across his desk. The wedding band hammered into the wall. The final carved message. "Tell Sarah I tried. Mrs. Cole, I think you should come to Fort Bragg. There are things I need to show you. Things Raymond left behind." "He left a message?" Her voice cracks just slightly. "Yes, ma'am. Several. He thought of you at the end. He wanted you to know." The silence on the line is profound. Then, "I'll be there tomorrow." That evening, as the sun sets over Fort Bragg, Morris drives out to the sinkhole site. Sheriff Wade's deputies have cordoned it off, yellow tape fluttering in the hot wind. The excavation team has finished for the day. The bodies are gone, transported to Dover for formal identification and preparation. But the bunker remains. Morris stands at the edge of the sinkhole, looking down into the exposed entrance. Emergency lights powered by a generator cast harsh shadows on the concrete walls below. He can see the ladder rungs, the sealed door standing open now, the darkness beyond. He thinks about going down again, seeing the chamber in the evening light, or what passes for light 40 feet underground. But his feet won't move. Something Luther said echoes in his mind. That place wanted to stay buried. His investigation will continue. Toxicology will come back showing trace elements of Project Sentinel compounds, enough to raise questions, but not enough for certainty. Families will receive detailed briefings. There will be funerals with full honors, flag-draped caskets, a memorial with all 42 names. But standing here in the dying light, Morris knows some questions won't have answers, like why the dog tags were arranged alphabetically, why the rifles were stacked with such precision, why a man who'd already murdered 41 soldiers took the time to hammer a wedding ring into concrete before arranging his victims in perfect circles. The generator sputters, and for just a moment, the lights below flicker. Morris steps back from the edge. Behind him, unseen, the wind picks up, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth and something older, something that's been waiting in the North Carolina soil since long before the Army built its bunkers and tested its chemical nightmares. The land remembers, and some graves, no matter how deep, are never truly quiet.